All right, let's get started, everyone. I hope you're doing well and staying. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here and to bring together our customers across the Americas. My name is Romina Rigoni, coming to you from Refinitiv in New York City, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on Argentina's debt restructuring. Refinitiv is committed to supporting you and provide you with the best insights during these crazy times that we're living. And in the absence of face-to-face interactions, we're offering different webinars with our internal experts, clients, and partners, like the one we're doing today on a very timely topic for emerging markets. I'd like to introduce you to our three presenters who will shed some light into the complicated situation that Argentina is in and what we can expect in the near future as negotiations between the country and its creditors continue to be extended. Our first speaker is Miguel Kigel, economist and financial consultant. He's currently executive director of Econviews, a Buenos Aires-based consultant firm, and he's presenting the macroeconomic picture. Up next, we have Gustavo Nefa, founder, partner, and director at Research for Traders, a Buenos Aires-based capital markets research firm that conducts in-depth reviews on financial markets with a focus on LATAM and Argentina. And also Sebastián Maril, partner at Research for Traders as well. Gustavo and Sebastián will comment on the actual deal, the plans being proposed, and the instruments, as well as the positive outcomes for the negotiation. Before we jump into it, and to touch on structure briefly, the session is going to consist of a 50-minute discussion by our three speakers, followed by a Q&A section at the end. So we ask that the participants, if you have any questions or point of clarifications regarding any of the topics that we cover, please send them to us via the Q&A box on your screen, and ideally say if it's for Miguel, Gustavo, or Sebastián. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the webinar, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for an active discussion. So with that, I hand it over to Miguel to kick off the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Romina. And it's a pleasure to be here with Gustavo and Sebastián sharing our views on Argentina's debt restructuring. What I'll do is concentrate primarily on the macroeconomic situation in Argentina, which I think in many ways is special. Special first because Argentina had big imbalances and big question marks before the whole COVID-19 issue appeared. Second, I think that Argentina is in many ways responding like other countries to the COVID-19 crisis, are trying primarily to deal with the macro impacts that it has and with the social impacts that it has. But it has two restrictions, or two things that makes the situation much more complicated. First, to deal in a situation in which the country is restructuring the debt. All along has been restructuring the debt and didn't have any access to the financial markets, which means primarily that all the financing that it needs has to be obtained from the central bank. The central bank has become the first and last lender of last resort to the treasury, which means that essentially it's financed by printing money and using international reserves. The second issue, which makes it different, is that Argentina is facing this with a very high inflation. So it started the year last year it finished with 55% inflation. And as a result, the risks in terms of printing money to what it can do to the inflation process are really much larger. Now, in a normal country, where inflation is 2-3% per annum, if things go wrong, perhaps inflation can go to 6%, 4%, 5%, somewhere around there. It can double and wouldn't be a major issue. In Argentina, with an inflation rate of 55%, if something goes wrong, then inflation, if things go very wrong, could go to 3 digits. And that's one of the challenges that the central bank is facing at the moment. So we have that said, I would say, well, let me start and explain a little bit what are we seeing in terms of economic activity. what we are seeing on the fiscal deficit, which has clearly deteriorated, then move on to try to figure out what the inflation risk is, given what I mentioned at the beginning, that Argentina is really printing a lot of money, as many other countries, but with a bigger risk. And then move on to what we're seeing on the exchange rate market, and finally on the debt, where I'm going to be very brief because Gustavo and Sebastián, I'm sure, are going to speak quite a bit about that. So what are we seeing in Argentina? What can we expect in terms of economic activity? How deep is the recession? These are some indicators of mobility. They're very, very popular now to use, to look at Google, that help us to understand mobility. And what this shows is essentially what's been mobility in some of the developed countries. We can see what goes on in terms of what's going on in Italy and Spain, which dropped dramatically. Then they had a bottom down for a number of months, and now they're coming back clearly. And what we're seeing also there is Germany and the US. All of them are recovering, probably where the mobility dropped more. They're recovering faster. The US and Germany, they fell less, and they're still recovering. So what are we seeing in terms of where we are in Latin America, and especially in Argentina? Here I have the three largest countries of the region: Argentina, which is our interest, and compared to Brazil and Mexico, and we also have Chile there. It's interesting that Brazil and Mexico, the economic activity dropped less and is now recovering very, very slowly. Argentina had one of the probably stricter lockdowns that there were in the region. GDP or mobility also dropped dramatically, probably similar to what we saw in Spain and Italy, without all the many cases or deaths. It started very early, probably bottomed down at around April, beginning of April. And then since the lockdown has been relaxed, what we are seeing is some improvement, but clearly we are far behind. And from what it seems now, the government is thinking about a new lockdown, a stricter one, so economic activity is going to remain very much dormant. That means that we can expect a very large drop in GDP in Argentina. The GDP is going to drop probably north of 10%. The IMF came up with an estimate of 9.9%. Probably it's going to be a little bit worse, and let me explain why. Here we have three scenarios. Essentially, as everyone has these different letters that we can imagine it could happen, is the V. We very much think that the GDP is going to drop around close to 20%, not there, but probably around 18% in the first 2 quarters of the year. The first quarter already dropped a little over 5%. Second quarter is going to be probably close to 14%. So it's going to be a drop of 18%. The question is, how quickly can we recover? The best scenario, and perhaps we're betting on that one, is one in which looks more or less like a V. For that to happen, though, what we were thinking is, by now the lockdown would have been relaxed. By now, Argentina would have restructured the debt, and none of these two things happened. So probably it's going to be a V, but it's going to start later. So it's likely that we're going to see a recovery. There are concerns that the recovery could be slower in Argentina than in other countries, and mainly that depends on policies. If Argentina continues to drag along and not solve the debt, if Argentina continues to give wrong signals to the investment community, such as it did with the expropriation or the announcement of the expropriation of Vicentin, then it's going to be a problem. We still think that we are basically betting on a drop along the lines, perhaps a little bit worse than the IMF numbers. Now, this drop in GDP plus the impact of the expansion, the fiscal stimulus, or more than stimulus, is trying to keep people alive and firms alive, keeping life within the hibernation, as we say, is leading to a large fiscal deficit. Here what we have is the primary deficit of Argentina, which is now, we estimate it to be at around 5% of GDP. Clearly, this reverses a process that was started especially during the Macri administration that brought down the primary deficit to around 0.5% of GDP. The reversal is happening everywhere. I mean, this deterioration in the fiscal accounts were unavoidable. Argentina, obviously, as all countries in the world, having established the lockdown, was forced to make big transfers to people for social reasons, has transferred money to companies, to all types of companies, in order to try to minimize the social impact and get the economy ready to rebound once a lockdown ends. However, I mean, the cost has been very, very large on the fiscal side, around 5% of GDP. On top of that, we also have some loans, guaranteed loans and other things, but this is the basic effect. Now, this raises two questions. The first one is, will it be reversed in the future? In other words, this large fiscal expansion will lead next year to around a deficit of around 2% of GDP, as probably is now in some projections, because we don't have a budget, we don't have a program, but people have in their minds that it go down to 2% of GDP, or it will remain perhaps at not 5% of per clue levels to 3% of GDP. That waits to be seen. Clearly, my sense is that there's going to be an IMF program, and with the IMF program, I think the deficit will be probably closer to 2% of GDP, but that will imply a reversal in many policies that some people in the government are thinking, and some issues such as reducing subsidies to utilities, which are now going up, and not providing social subsidies forever. The other issue which has been floating around is, how is the government going to finance the deficit, and what does it imply for monetary policy? Let me jump to there. And trying to understand what is the impact of this expansion on money supply and on the risk that Argentina will face inflation. First of all, we're seeing an increase in money supply. We are seeing in the two main aggregates, which is the orange line is M2, which is basically money in circulation, all the kind of checking accounts, savings accounts, and cash that people have, people and firms. And that's been clearly expanding since the end of last year. Before the COVID-19, there was already some expansion. And the second is the monetary base, which is growing much less. Monetary base, which I'm up and down, the central bank is somewhat managed to control the growth of monetary base, as we will see in a minute, and this has been critical to try to tame so far the risk of inflation. What's been happening? This is the balance sheet of the central bank to show what's going on with the monetary base and to show why we think that so far the central bank is doing a good job in terms of trying to limit the monetary impact of financing. Well, what's been going on? The central bank has in fact financed, look at the blue lines with our this year. The central bank has financed the treasury at the tune of roughly 1 billion pesos, 1 trillion pesos for you guys this year, which is equivalent roughly to a little bit over 3% of GDP. This is the issuance so far. Clearly, this is a lot of money. If you keep that money around for a long time, clearly inflation is going to get out of control. However, the central bank, what it's been doing is been sterilizing part of those pesos that it was issued through two mechanisms, mainly through the issuance of repos and primarily through LELIQs. LELIQs are, I would say, they say central bank notes, but they're only sold to banks. So the banks are the holders of those notes. As a result, the increase in the monetary base has been relatively small. That's 25% of the whole financing to the treasury. What does it mean in practice? In practice, it means that the central bank or the treasury has financed itself primarily with debt, but debt not issued by the treasury, but issued by the central bank. So central bank debt so far has been financing the treasury. Now, in spite of that effort, the money supply has increased. Not so much the monetary base, but yes, the money supply has gone up. How much? We said roughly money supply relative to a year ago has increased roughly 100%, has doubled in a year. Is that a risk? How much inflation can we expect? 100%? The answer is no. Why? Primarily because part of the increase in the money supply, this is what shows this money supply as a ratio to GDP. So it's one having a sense of, typically you want this to be roughly stable. At around, in the case of Argentina, at around 9% of GDP. When money is less than 9% of GDP, money is too tight. When money is above 10%, 9% of GDP, you can say that you have loose money. And in this case, money is gone down to last year to around 6.5% of GDP. So it was a period of very tight money. And what happened? The first increase in the money supply essentially was compensating for the very tight money during the last months of the Macri administration. And after that, there was clearly an increase in money supply. And now I would say what some people could say is an overhang of money. There's probably too much money for what the economy needs, and there is a risk of inflation. So people say, why don't we see inflation today? Very good reason is that people and companies at the moment are holding more money, mainly because they don't know how to spend it. They cannot buy dollars because there's a lot of restrictions on the dollar market. There are foreign exchange controls. They don't buy many goods because what they want to buy, there's not really a lot of stores being open. And people have money because of precautionary reasons, especially firms. Firms have a lot of cash at the moment, the ones that have cash, of course. They have a lot of cash on average, and that cash is being held as liquidity because they don't know what the future, what they expect about the future. So there's an excess of money. Now we think that once the lockdown finish and there's more sense that things are going back to the new normal, as people say, once you get there, then what we're going to see is that we should go back to the ratio closer to 9% of GDP. And how are we going to get there? Our guess is, either GDP goes up or prices go up. They don't need to go up 100%, but they do need to go up in order to reduce the money supply. They don't need to go up from one day to the next. That doesn't mean inflation is going to be ramping in the near future. But over time, say 12 to 18 months, we should see this ratio going back to this level. And primarily it's going to be through increases in prices. Now, we have a number of questions in our mind. Will the central bank keep printing money or not? Will the deficit come down? Have we seen the worst in terms of fiscal deficit? All these are open questions which are important to keep in mind when thinking about Argentina's inflation. The other thing is that we've seen, this is the stock of central bank debt, which is the sum of the leaks and reverse repos. It's clearly going up significantly in recent months, primarily because, as we said, the fiscal deficit is being financed through central bank debt. Is this a risk? We don't see that as a risk. Again, in the short run, over time, it could be. Now, there's an interesting question, and that is, what's the mechanism that, that will be the transmission mechanism from money to inflation? If you look at interest rates, there are different interest rates. We can look at any of them. Maybe the gray area is the policy rate. We saw, especially during the Macri years, that the government, the central bank, follow a very tight policy of very tight money. And tight money, as you can see, with interest rates that reach close to 85%, and these were very short 7-day interest rates, very high interest rates, they didn't make a dent on inflation. Inflation continued to grow, and we finished with inflation last year of 55%. Now this year, interest rates are lower, and that money supply is looser. That doesn't mean that money supply is going to lead to inflation very quickly. The mechanism in Argentina, at least, that we see the transmission mechanism from money to inflation as there is kind of a transmission mechanism, and the intermediary is the exchange rate. I know that here there are a lot of points, but let's look at this period where you can see it clearly, and probably what we're going to see in the future is something like this. The bars are the rate of inflation. The dots here are the rate of the depreciation of the currency. And it's clear that while the exchange rate was stable, inflation was stable, when the government, and this is Fábrega, the central bank governor in January 2014, there was a depreciation of the currency, and see what happened. Inflation went up. It went up for 3 months, and then once the currency stabilized again, inflation went back. If you look in detail, I'm not going to go because of lack of time, but if you look in detail here, you would see that each time that inflation went up dramatically, here, or here, that's 2016, that's the 2018 when you had the currency crisis, that's after the primaries in last year when Macri lost. Each time you see the same pattern. Devaluation, you have a peak on inflation, then inflation comes down. And in 2000, I emphasize 2014 for one reason, because it's very similar to what we're seeing today. The government is basically have foreign exchange controls. There's official rate and a parallel rate. The central bank didn't have almost any reserves. Today, the central bank has very few reserves. And the pattern was as this. At one point, the central bank saw that they had no reserves, and it was forced to devalue. It devalued the currency, probably not significantly, around 30% in around 3 months. But inflation went up, as you can see there, with a peak of around 5%. So we have this situation. And this is more or less is one possible outcome of how the situation can play out in the near future. The alternative is the central bank will depreciate faster the currency, but it's not doing that at the moment. Now, one of the things that could lead to that scenario is the small amount of reserves. Argentina has very small amount of reserves, 11 billion roughly, which for Argentina is nothing. I mean, Argentina is a country that would need net reserves in the range of $40 to $50 billion to function normally. So at the moment, we're far from there. Part of those net reserves are illiquid. So clearly, the central bank will have to monitor day to day. And if this number keeps falling, then we can see more the devaluation more likely. We had a period, and this shows net reserves, that reserves were dropping all this year that the central bank was selling. How did it solve the situation, the central bank? By putting tighter foreign exchange controls. They put big controls, and reserves starting to go up again. Now, there's a limit to this. The central bank can protect reserves, but the cost of these controls is eventually an increase in the parallel exchange rate or the blue chip rate, all the alternative exchange rates that we have in the market. And when that happens, the foreign exchange market becomes dysfunctional. People do not import, exports go down, and you have a lot of side effects which could affect the behavior, the evolution of the economy, and certainly they affect growth. Now, so the key to see whether policies are sustainable is the behavior of the alternative exchange rates. Today, we have a gap between what we call the blue chip and the official rate. That has, at one point, it was close to 80%. Now it's closer to 50%, primarily because of the imposition of foreign exchange controls. But if reserves stay at this level, I think that the central bank will not be able to gain reserves, and I think that few months, I don't know, if somewhere down the road, probably sooner rather than later, we will have an IMF program because Argentina has to pay back to the IMF the 44 billion it owes, and it cannot do it without a program. An IMF program has to refinance, and this is going to be one of the issues. So the the IMF has essentially two obsessions. The first one is fiscal. As people say, the IMF means it's mostly fiscal. And the second is the exchange rate. In fact, in the case of the Macri administration, they were much more concerned about the exchange rate than the fiscal. And, unfortunately, that's the experience didn't go very well. So I think that, with an IMF program, with low reserves, with the fact that we have a large spread and probably that money supply will go up rather than down in the near future, there's going to be more liquidity. That means that, the risk of the devaluation clearly is around the corner. Is it going to be a huge devaluation? No, probably. The scenario looks very similar to the one we had in 2014. So if you want, just look at what happened there and perhaps you can learn something or try to see what might happen in the near future. It's interesting that, if you look at the exchange rate, this is a measure of the real effective exchange rate, which tries to measure where the peso is weak or strong in real terms. This is against what we call the multilateral exchange rate, which means against a basket of currencies. For example, what this says is when this is high, the peso was very weak. When this is low, it means the peso was very strong. I would say today the peso looks fair value from a long-term perspective, and even one could argue it's a little bit on the weak side. Now, does it mean that there shouldn't be a devaluation if the peso is fair value? The answer is depends, as any good economist will say. Depends on what? Primarily on whether, the Argentina needs to generate foreign exchange, whether Argentina has instruments to generate growth or to have an expansionary policies. And at the moment, the answer is no to both questions. Argentina needs reserves, needs to build reserves, and two, Argentina needs to have some stimulate policies to get growth. It cannot be fiscal because we have no financing. It cannot be monetary because inflation is already very high. So I think the exchange rate would be the appropriate policy to try to get the economy moving. Let me go to the last issue, which is debt. As I mentioned before, probably Gustavo and Sebastián are going to have probably a better view or a deeper view of the issue. I just want to mention a few points. The first one is that probably the worst in terms of spreads for emerging market is behind us. Spreads for high yield and for emerging markets have come down, which is it's a good sense. It's probably some good news for Argentina because it should be easier to restructure. The second thing is essentially what I see as the main issues today, mainly on the macro and then probably a few things on the legal, but I'll just mention them with the idea of making sure the points are on the table. The first issue is today Argentina is in default. I mean, I hear lots of people saying hard default, soft default, selective default. Argentina is in default, period. The CDS triggered and Argentina is in default. Now, it's true that I think there are negotiations going on. Argentina may make the big mistake in the first offer. I think it weakened itself because essentially gave a lot of power to the bondholders group, which I think they are in a way are the leaders that everyone is going to follow. If Argentina reaches an agreement with the bondholders group, with the three of them, then I think everyone else will say, let's jump on the deal. If Argentina doesn't reach that deal, it's going to be very difficult, that agreement. It's going to be very difficult for other bondholders to follow. The other thing which is important is that Argentina doesn't have a typical solvency problem. Debt to GDP ratio is around 54% of GDP, which many countries have that debt to GDP ratio and don't have a problem of debt sustainability. The problem in Argentina is essentially one of credibility, that Argentina is what it's been doing over time. It's lost the credibility and no one is willing to roll over the debt. Positions are very close. I think that, there's if this were any other negotiation, not between Argentina and these bondholders, I would say a deal is around the corner. So far, it hasn't happened. And in part, I think because of the IMF. The IMF kind of, I don't know if naively or why, it provided a scenario which is the kind of numbers about debt sustainability. Those numbers are not written in stone. Those numbers have been done without considering number of changes in policies. I think that they are very, very, in my view at least, they are very weak, and they're not kind of they're not based on strong foundations, if you want to call. But the government is basically taking that as the Bible. Say we cannot pay more because the IMF says we cannot pay more. And if you look at the projections, I think that they leave a lot to be desired. I think we need to get a way out of those numbers as being the basis for the discussion. And the last point I wanted to make here is that, in order for Argentina to get out of default, it essentially needs to reach with all the bondholders. I think if Argentina just agrees with with some of the bondholders and not with others, it will not reap the benefits of an agreement, because for many foreign investors, Argentina will be in default. For many of the rating agencies, Argentina will be in default, and the spreads that Argentina will pay will be default spreads. Simply, I'm sure that Sebastián and Gustavo are going to talk more. I just mentioned simply that where the problems are, the legal issues are on the table about whether the CACs or the collective action clauses are going to be the same for all bondholders, or the exchange bondholders will get a better deal than the others. I'm not going to talk about a lot about that. The only thing I want to mention, perhaps, of the issues is whether it makes sense to have a GDP warrant or an export warrant or not. I think in the case of Argentina, we had a very bad experience with the GDP warrant, and I think it would be a mistake to repeat the same thing, and I don't think should be part of the deal. My time is over, essentially. Let me just finish with a summary. I think that Argentina is in a tough situation at the moment because of the default, because of the fiscal deficit, because of inflation. And a lot of the discussion is being put on the weight of, Argentina needs to solve the debt. And if we solve the debt, once we solve the debt, everything is going to fall into place. And what I just want to say is that probably that's over-optimistic. Not probably, almost surely it's over-optimistic. Argentina faces big challenges. Why? Because, I think this is a necessary, very necessary, but not sufficient condition for Argentina to start growing again. Without the debt, without solving the debt, the situation is going to be extremely weak. The risk of inflation getting a little bit much higher is clearly there, and the probability that Argentina can recover quickly from the big recession or the big depression would be very small. Now, this is the first stage. What other challenges does Argentina have? Essentially, Argentina has a problem with the fiscal. The government needs to show how it plans to reduce the fiscal deficit, how it plans to reduce the very heavy tax pressure that Argentina has, how it plans to reduce government expenditures, how it plans to deal with the money overhang, how it plans to remove all the foreign exchange controls that today we have. So clearly, how it plans to deal with the utility rates that today are frozen, how it plans to remove all the price controls, especially on food, medicines, and other necessary things. So clearly, this is necessary, but Argentina still needs to show what the economic program is. Argentina wanted to restructure the debt before and then announce a program with the IMF. Probably did it the wrong way, and we probably will pay a price for that. stop here, and I think thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Miguel. I think Gustavo is up next. So over to you. Gustavo, you may be on mute. Gustavo? Of course, this is pretty common during a live session. I guess, Miguel, if I can just quickly ask you one of the questions that we got from the audience.
Okay.
You've highlighted many macroeconomic variables that are not in good shape, right? What is your biggest concern with the economy?
Okay, Argentina hasn't grown in 10 years. The decade of the second decade of the 21st century has been a lost decade. Argentina desperately needs to grow because, and this year was going to be the first year that was going to grow. And unfortunately, we're going to have a drop of around 10% of GDP. Which means that, in fact, we're going back to the GDP we had probably at the beginning of the century. So it's 2 decades lost. So I think how does it get growth back? And I think what Argentina needs is a package. It's not a single bullet that can solve this issue. It's not just the debt. It's not just removing the foreign exchange controls. But when you think about it, about all the issues that are needed, I think that probably the first one is to get the exchange rate right. I think, to the extent that in Argentina, we Argentines are obsessed with dollars, and the dollar and the exchange rate, really, we look at every day, and we have all this uncertainty about the exchange rate, about buying dollars, about payments abroad. That's very disruptive. So I think you need to get the exchange rate right. The second issue is you need to reduce the fiscal deficit, which is in a way a source of concern because we have no financing, and probably next year we're going to have a very small amount of financing, especially in foreign currency. And what we're seeing is the financing in pesos is barely sufficient to roll over the peso instrument. So I think that Argentina needs also, to get the fiscal house in order. And the third thing is, it has to start to send the right signals to investors, because when you think about growth, where is growth going to come from? Growth might come from, the government thinking about public works, about subsidies to the private sector. I'm sure they're going to come up with thinking about lines of credit. And the truth is, there's no fiscal space. Argentina has used all the fiscal space this year it has just simply to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. The central bank and the banks have no money to lend because, all the money at the moment is being used to finance the treasury, as I said, indirectly through the banking system. So the only source of growth is the private sector. And there, I think that, we have a government that's sending very mixed signals about how much intervention it wants to do in the private sector. I mean, we recently have an event where the government announced the expropriation of a company, Vicentin, which is a trader. Clearly, that's not the right way. We have some of congressmen saying that, we should expropriate, that the government should take shares in companies that have supported. That's not the way. Continues with price controls, with controls in utilities, is going to try to kind of prosecute or people who buy dollars, or companies that buy dollars or that bought dollars in the past. I think it has to change that view and come much with a market-friendly view. So I think all these three things are very, very important.
Thank you, Miguel. Great overview. We're going to go to Sebastian. while we fix Gustavo. Sebastian, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, everybody, for participating in this presentation. I'm responsible for giving you the boring part of the restructuring, no charts, no graphs, no picture, just the hardcore text of what's about to happen right now with Argentina debt restructuring Saga, which is the legal aspects of this presentation. We believe that we are very close. We are very close economically. We are $2.50. We are $7 for another group. Right now, we are concentrating in the legal aspects of the protection of creditors moving forward, which is very important because from the very beginning, demands from certain group of creditors have been focused on keeping the old 2005 indenture versus a new 2016 indenture. First of all, where we stand right now. As you probably know, Argentina late last week extended the acceptance period for another 34 days. This was the 5th extension since April 21st when Argentina launched the exchange offer. The previous days were the previous extensions were 14, 11, 10, 7 days. This is good news that Argentina extended for another 34 days because for reasons that we are going to talk about right now, but it also hides the complexity of what's about to happen with the restructuring. Argentina, who just declared the restructuring efforts a failure last Friday, blamed Wall Street, as he always does. We always blame Wall Street for our problems. And see its creditors ring the bells at Judge Loretta Presca's court, and see a lot of litigation started against our country, as we have seen in the past. But perhaps unexpectedly, the government instead showed a strong commitment to reach out to creditors and start negotiating during the next 20, 25 days to see what happens. Let's talk numbers, as Miguel previously mentioned before. Argentina and its creditors have exchanged proposals with an average NPV that is too close to just throw it all away. We are very close, and both sides know this. On average, the Republic and bondholder group, which is Gramercy, Fintech, Redlock, UBS, are just $2.50 apart, using an exit yield of 10%. While the other two groups, which right now are working as one, the exchange bondholder group, which is HBK Investment, Monarch, and others, as well as ad hoc bondholders group, which is BlackRock, Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, and Ashmore, among others, are $7 apart. These two groups represent roughly 30% of all the exchange bonds and also 30% of the global bonds, so-called macro bond. Together, they have enough firepower to just shut down the restructuring efforts that Argentina launched a couple of months ago. If Argentina, we believe that if Argentina improved its offer by $2, it would just close the deal with the bondholder group. Just a side note, today we have rumors that Argentina had actually done this. However, it was a mistake by some news outlet or by the social networks that actually incorrectly interpreted what Martin Guzman actually said about a deal having been reached. It was just an understanding on certain issues regarding the restructuring. So far, no deal with any other groups. If Gramercy, Redlock, Fintech actually accept the Argentina's new proposal, most likely it will bring on board most or some retail investors. Remember that back in May 8th, the first deadline, about 15% of all bonds outstanding accepted Argentina's offer by the original deadline, meaning that if we have these funds on board, most likely we reach a 30-35% threshold. If on top of the $2, Argentina also offers non-economic sweetener, which we talk right now, then it would most likely satisfy the demands of the other big guns, the Greylocks, the Fintechs, et cetera, et cetera. This is the most important things that, according to the government and according to recent presentations and proposals put together by the two groups, stand. This is a major disagreement. First of all, creditors have expressed very deep concerns over Argentina's redesignation clause, which allows the government to declare a successful debt exchange without reaching the proper collective action clause levels. I'm not going to explain right now with this redesignation clauses because we have already mentioned this before, and most likely, if you are a creditor, you are aware of it. Argentina also has a very particular external debt definition of external debt. For Argentina, external debt will be any debt issued from now on, meaning that whatever is outstanding, it will no longer be considered as external debt, whereas the bondholders want more common sense approach and say, look, external debt is external debt. Don't mess around with the Encyclopedia Britannica definition. Also, the cross-default clauses are on both sides, which means that because most likely the new and improved events of defaults presented by the bondholder group and the exchange bondholder group are criticized by the government. They have put together some very interesting, which I'm going to mention right now, clauses that if Argentina fails to comply, they will be declared under a default. For instance, Argentina needs to present some sort of periodically published data on its debt stock and complete IMF Article 4 consultation each year. The bondholders actually put together a very interesting proposal, which I think is very, very interesting for Argentina to accept and consider, which is the mandatory redemption. According to the bondholders, so long as the new bonds remain outstanding, at least 50% of the net proceeds will have to go to refinance outstanding debt. This will put a nice, limit on the type of indenture Argentina will actually be able to do. By the year, $500 million to retire
Yeah, hold on, Sebas. I think we had some background noise. Is it fixed? I think it looks good now.
Okay, perfect. Finally, and this is the most important part, a new bond and the Argentina wants to use the indenture. This is a no-go to exchange holders. We believe that Argentina has unofficially offered the exchange holders these 20 indentures global bond holders will be stuck with 2016 that BlackRock and other holders won the 2005 indenture, which is for Argentina unacceptable. This will be the concentration of the negotiations in the next couple of weeks. Why this is a major problem? The 2016 indenture is not enough. Argentina is a country that always makes mistakes. We always get into trouble. And bondholders want to be protected. They don't want to be exposed to any future default, restructuring, credit crunch, or some sort of crisis that most likely will affect the country. For instance, the Macri bonds prospectus, the 2016 indenture, shows that enforcement rights, meaning that if you want to litigate against the country, a trustee has to do it for you. Individually, it's very difficult for you to do it, although you can do it, but it's very difficult for you to initiate any litigations during the next couple of weeks if you want to declare Argentina in default. A single default, a single bondholder may still file suit only after the bond has matured, meaning that if you have the century bond, you can only initiate legal actions against Argentina in 100 years. Again, you still have the ability to move ahead and litigate against Argentina as individual bondholder if three very important complex conditions occur. I'm not going to talk about them right now because they're very complex, but they're very difficult to attain, meaning that you are stuck most likely with the trustee. If the trustee actually litigates for you, you will be forced to share all your proceedings with every single bondholder that has your series of bonds. Meaning that you're not the beneficiary of your litigation. If you have funded your own litigation against Argentina, circulated in New York court for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, and pay lawyers to represent you, if you actually get a money judgment, you will have to distribute that amount among every other single creditor, regardless or not whether that creditor has actually initiated. That's why everybody wants, what's called the Ferrari. Everybody wants the 205 indenture. Whether or not it's going to be the new sweetener, we will see in the next couple of weeks. The Kirchner bonds allow individual bondholders to file lawsuits in New York upon the occurrence of an event. We have seen this in the past. ML Capital, Paul Singer, et cetera, have done this. That there's no need to share your proceedings. You will be able to benefit from your own legal lawsuits. Yes, Kirchner bonds are investor friendly. It sounds weird, but that's actually true. Investors want the 2005 indenture because it protects them more than the 2016 Macri bonds. Whether Argentina will use this as a sweetener, we don't know. And as I said before, Argentina has unofficially agreed with the 205, with the exchange bond holders, to offer this in the new bonds. We will see whether that's actually true or not. Since my time is right now, let me give you the conclusion. With economic proposals too close to walk away empty-handed, in recent days, we have seen the legal aspects of the restructuring be the major point of the negotiations. The economic aspects of the proposal have taken a backseat, although not gone away, of course. But now both sides are focusing on the legal aspects of the exchange offer. We strongly believe that if Argentina improves a couple of bucks from the current NPV of 49.7, average NPV of 49.7, it will close the deal with bondholder group, and most likely everybody else will jump into the exchange. Now, this is where we stand right now. It's all about legal aspects. It's not about economics. Economics, of course, will continue to be an issue, but they are very close money-wise. They are very far apart in terms of legal aspects. Give it back to Gustavo, whether it's online or not. We will see right now, but I can take any questions while Gustavo jumps into the presentation.
Thank you, Sebastián. Gustavo, let's give it a try.
Let's make a try. Let me go to the presentation.
Sure.
There is not much time, but I cannot see my presentation right now.
We can move it for you. It's on, I think it's on the screen, your first deck. Yeah.
So, Miguel described a big picture, expecting % GDP for the current year, and a rebound of around 4.5%. That we are expecting inflation figures to recover the 50% area by mid-2021. We're coming from 2 recessions, and this will be the 3rd recession year. We are a little bit expecting a bad year on the fiscal deficit of around 6% of GDP. And second page, with exchange rate increase since 2012 until 2015, with a 50% spread that may increasingly some restrictions are being removed by the central bank. These restrictions that were imposed months ago, and together with a blue chip swap around 50%, with official rates decreasing 16%, and that brings the 50% spread that it is complicating all the things in Argentina regarding in private investments. And the total central bank assistance to the treasury on a 12-month trailing and as a percentage of GDP reaching figures by year end. The devaluation is going to the 45-47% at annualized rate by the end of the year. That means that we should take care of which alternatives between pesos and Argentine bonds an investment should select in its portfolio. Negotiations failed until now. We've listened to Sebastian and to Miguel, but we are confident that there will be an agreement, although not complete, because there will be holdouts remaining. And there are three big groups that have different tendencies and pretensions. The first one is the bondholder group. It holds in that 2016 Macri bonds, led by Greylocks. On the other hand, you have the exchange bondholder groups that has the indebtor 2005, reopened in 2010. In the middle, you have ad hoc group that has both group of tendencies, 2005 and 2016. But what we are seeing in the market is that the country risk is showing us maybe there is not caring much about deadlines, but on the forms that this deal should be done. We've listened to Sebastian, and the main problem is legal, because there is something like $2 and $5 of differences between the government and the free groups on an average. And this is something that may come to an agreement over the short term. A question that our clients are asking us is regarding dollar bonds. Argentinian laws bonds are waiting in the sidelines. They're waiting an agreement for the New York law and to be extended to them the same characteristics of the bonds that will be issued. Regarding the first proposal that is on the table, that was issued by the government, there are several changes that are increasing net present value. The principal haircut was reduced to 3% only. There are several annual amortizations, and also the coupons were brought forward by another year, with bonds seeing the first coupon in 2021. The average coupon rate also was raised, and up to a maximum to 5%. Also, the accrued interest will be recognized. There is a 2030 maturity bond that should pay, the government should pay to creditors all these past due interest. And also there is an export recovery instrument, a warrant, that is added to the offer. We valued this offer at 10% ex-yield. This is a conservative scenario. And the $50 more or less that is worth the offer, if you add the interest, you reach $51 offer, You have to sum up $1 plus with the export recovery instrument. So maybe the value of this offer with 10% exit yield is more or less $52. Okay, but if you value this offer with a 12% exit yield, it will reach more or less $45. This is something that the market have been discounting, and the increase that we've seen in the price of bond in the last couple of months, with country risk reaching 2,500 basic points, is mainly due because although there is an extension of the negotiations up to the 24th of July, markets are confident that there will be an agreement. I repeat, this agreement reaching between 50 and 75% of the total bonds. So some series will be converted, some others will remain as a holdout. If you take into account the peso bonds curve, the slope of those, that this is a market that the government wants to be preserved due to its high funded needs. The bonds are reaching between 55 and 65 nominal yield to maturities rates, suggesting all our clients since last year to position in this curve, and we still do it. Valuations on the 2020 and 2021 bonds, and we are moving we're moving our client to 2022 and 2023 maturities. Some of them are able also to absorb a risk to go with peso bonds indexed to the inflation index to up to 2024. In the sovereign world, we are seeing a lot of interest to reach an agreement with its creditor, intending to move forward with some payments on dollar bonds. And we are seeing that some provinces are pushing ahead restructuring of its debt beyond province of Buenos Aires. We are also an offer that was rejected by its creditor. Province of Cordoba will follow, and some others too. On the to end this presentation, we are seeing a lot of complications in the near term for some creditors to reach their payments, because some issuances will reach its payment date, and in the energy sector, more complicated name, have been its cash flow reduced or frozen by regulations dictated by the government. And last but not least, MSCI has conserved the emerging market status for Argentinian equities, but we think that by September or October, a revision can put Argentina in a frontier market index. So this is more or less what I wanted to tell you. And just to be confident that there will be an agreement if all the legal issues are overdue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo. That was great, and I really appreciate you shifting to your phone while we were live. I do have a lot of questions that we're getting through the Q&A, and we're going to target those to the different presenters. The next one I'm going to make to Sebastián. The question is, do you see increased chances that a new round of lawsuits are brought against Argentina following the restructuring?
Just let's remember something. We are still dealing with plenty of lawsuits from the previous 2005 and 2010 restructuring, meaning that right now we have roughly $495 million in New York Southern District Court that have not been settled and continue to litigate in the country. We will see very important news in the next couple of weeks on two of those litigations that most likely will come down against Argentina on roughly $230 million worth of loans. Having said that, yes, I believe that, as Gustavo mentioned, we will have holdouts. The problem and the question is, because exchange offer is not over yet. Exchange offer is not over yet. How many of those bondholders will be 2016 bonds and 2005 bonds? Why? Because we have holdouts in the 2016 indenture, it will be unlikely that they will cause much trouble in New York Southern District Court because of the type of protection, as I mentioned in my presentation. However, if those bondholders are exchange bondholders, meaning that they have par and discounts which are regulated under the 2005 indenture, you will see very strong and very fierce litigation in New York Southern District Court in coming months or whenever Argentina restructures. If Argentina restructures its debt using the redesignation clauses that it has put in place in the first and only official offer filed in the Securities Exchange Commission, you have a lot of bondholders circulated in New York filing lawsuits against Argentina because we believe the redesignation clause is not legally feasible for any bondholder to actually accept, put out of the restructuring or put into the restructure against his or her will. But yes, I will see a lot of litigation coming forward, but the frequency or intensity of that litigation depends on the type of bond that we litigate.
Got it. Great. Next question for Gustavo.
Yeah.
Gustavo,
Yes.
what treatment do you think the Argentine law bonds will have and another related to corporate bonds? Do you expect a potential restructuring of YPF debt?
I think the
YPF bonds
are following what is happening in the sovereign markets. There are expectations that this will follow, but remember that in 2001, YPF didn't default its debt. Neither did the City of Buenos Aires. Some credits are even less riskier than the sovereign, and we like YPF bonds, although YPF has some legal issues to resolve, and the market cap has been severely affected in the markets regarding this issue, coupled with the lower price of oil in international markets. So we still like the 2024 US dollar bonds. The coupon is 8.75%, and we like it for aggressive portfolios.
Great, thank you. Next one for Miguel, and I'm trying to get to all of the speakers. Miguel, if we have you there, there is no funding for the private sector to invest, grow, and Argentina has no private savings and no or limited capital markets. So how do you think the country will find capital?
Okay, first I think that What Sebastian mentioned just a minute ago is that the market differentiates between sovereign and sub-sovereign, especially the city of Buenos Aires, but could be Córdoba or Santa Fe or others. And the market differentiates between public sector and private sector, because we do expect many of the private sector companies to continue to pay even through this crisis, unless things really get out of control. But if Argentina restructured the debt, I think there's a good chance that Argentina will maintain credit, at least in access to the international markets. That wouldn't happen, of course, if Argentina ends up with this default, ends up being a very long default, and the situation doesn't improve. So my sense is, true, the capital market is small, domestic savings is small, but if things start to improve, and it depends very much on what type of signals the government gives. If the government, says, we need the private sector, we want the private sector, we're not going to kind of put price controls, allow them to make money, allow them to send foreign investors to send dividends abroad. I think there are many opportunities in Argentina, but that very much depends on what kind of. I think it's more important what type of signal the government gives the day after than other things. If the government has to send a clear signal that it wants the private sector to lead growth, that signal hasn't come yet, so that's something that we have to wait and see how it works.
Great. Do you think that signal would be enough from the bondholders to be the GDP warrant or some sort of confidence on economic recovery, that there is not any other risk that we go through other restructuring program?
I mean, the risk in Argentina, this is Argentina. Argentina defaulted in 2001, was in default, although in 2013 is in default again. Argentina hasn't managed to reduce the fiscal deficit, hasn't managed to reduce government expenditures. It's still very large as a share of GDP. It's a country that has been moving in a pendulum from someone like the Kirchners in 2010 to 2015 with very interventionist policies, lots of controls, foreign exchange, utility rates, and came Macri and just lifted all the controls almost in one stroke. Now came again Fernández and has to put a lot of controls back. So really, I think that, it's confidence, you don't gain it from one day to the next, okay? It takes time. Unfortunately, I think we have a government, a coalition, that's clearly sending very, I would say, different kind of signals, some in the right direction, some in the sense of the private sector, some in the opposite direction. I think that to really get growth going in Argentina, to have the GDP warrant really be, if it comes, being something that the market is going to appreciate and want to buy it significantly in significant amounts, I think we need more clear, more clear signals on the political front. So far, they're ambiguous, okay? So that in this environment, it's going to be difficult to generate kind of the market enthusiasm to get a lot of investment in Argentina. I think we need, even Macri, which sent clear signals, people were reluctant because they were precisely fearing that, after Macri, we could see the type of Cristina back. So we don't know exactly how these things are going to play out, whether Fernández would be kind of leader that will be able to attract foreign investment. And that's really is the key to the issue. It's not easy to signal, especially in a country like Argentina that goes back and forth so often.
Awesome. Definitely a lot of things unexpected. So I'm gonna close it with a question that will go around the horn to get the view from each of you. I will start with Sebastian. The question is, what would be the next step in the event that we don't get to an agreement by the next due date, which is July 24th? And would it be possible to extend even more? It looks like the market doesn't seem to worry about time. So Sebastian, you go first, and we go around the horn.
let's remember that the next deadline is July 24th, meaning that at least Argentina needs to keep the exchange offer open for 10 days according to SEC exchange offer rules, meaning that by July 24th, if we don't get a proposal, July 14th, we don't get a proposal, the July 24th proposal will be net debt, and Argentina will have to push indefinitely the new exchange, the new date again. There is no need for a limit on the amount of extensions that Argentina can put. We can kick the can down the road until December, January, if Argentina decides to do so. We don't have that much money due this year on international bonds. Maybe Gustavo or Miguel can correct me. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we have maturities in the next couple of weeks that we are not going to pay. We are concentrating right now in closing the gap monetarily-wise as well as legal-wise, as I explained in the presentation. And if we don't get close, it will be a very big mistake by the government because we are very, very close to just throw it all away. And the next step will be, for my understanding, is keep kicking the can down the road, but do not leave the negotiation table at all.
Great, thank you. So extending. Miguel, I think you are next.
Okay. I mean, as Sebastian has said, this can be extended. I mean, from a legal point of view, probably you can do it. Obviously, you get the risk of, I think, and probably Sebastian knows more than I do on this, but there could be the risk is that the longer you extend, the higher the risk that some bondholders would start legal actions, and then the situation gets much worse. I mean, clearly, what the government interest to avoid legal action, and if possible, to basically resolve the whole issue in one stroke and avoid any holdouts and any litigation in the future. So you have a clean way out of the default. Now, from an economic point of view, there is a difference, I think, because I think that you cannot extend this forever because Argentina is losing access, especially the private sector and the provinces are losing access to the provinces, to financing. And if the longer this continues, we're going to see then private sector default, provincial defaults, which are going to be difficult to remedy. And even worse, we're going to lose any credit whatsoever in order to finance whatever little amount of credit is available to finance the investment in Argentina. It's going to complicate the negotiations with the IMF. So I think that from an economic point of view, I think this can be extended, July, maybe August. But clearly, we're going to get started. We're going to pay a price for that extension if we go well beyond the July 31st or the end of July. Yeah.
Yes, Gustavo, can we get your view?
Yes, my view is that the deadline may be too early to finally reach an agreement. And maybe next steps for the government is to issue these bonds, to try to reach the maximum level of acceptances, and also to start to remove some of the restrictions that it has put on the economy. You know, all the foreign exchange restrictions are limiting us a lot with foreign direct investment in a year that would be really bad for our economy, really bad for the whole world also. But with soybean prices at around $320 a ton, and with several restrictions to exports, because the gap between what the exporters are receiving with tax retentions and also with a huge gap between the blue chip and the official FX rate, maybe we will be some additional restrictions that other countries in the region are not seeing right now. So I see a complicated scenario. The government, I think, was able to restrict the coronavirus expansion here in Argentina, but has been a mess in the economy, and also the fiscal and monetary policies are really expanding beyond its limits. We see an inflation that will start to run beyond 50%, and maybe by the end of the year we'll start a new problem that the government should be able to manage, that is the foreign exchange rate. If he wants to reduce the gap, I think the government should start to censor its foreign exchange price. So there are tough times in Argentina, and in between, stocks appears like an opportunity. Below $300, the S&P Merval, we think that there are real opportunities. Right now it stands at around $370 in blue chip swap rate. So maybe with a downside, an additional downside, it should start to give an additional opportunity to investors.
Awesome. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, we'll wrap it up at this point. I really want to thank you, Miguel, Gustavo, and Sebastián, for sharing your views with the audience and being great partners for Refinitiv. And to the audience as well, I apologize for any audio disruptions that you may have experienced, but we will make sure that you get the slides from the presenter, and we'll also be answering some of the lingering questions that we couldn't address today via email. I truly hope this presentation has been helpful and wish everyone a great rest of your week. Stay safe and see you in the next webinar. Bye, everyone.
Bye.